There is a name on a mailbox in Bavaria. A name that has been in that family for 6 generations, maybe more. A name that sounds unmistakably German, hard consonants, a familiar rhythm, the kind of surname you would find in any village directory from Saxony to the Rhine. And for centuries, that was the whole story. German name, German blood, German soil. Then the DNA arrived. Not a single test. Not one surprising result dismissed as a fluke. But a pattern, repeated across thousands of family lines, surfacing in Y chromosome studies and autosomal panels from research institutes across Europe. A pattern that suggested something uncomfortable and thrilling at once. Some of the most German surnames in existence did not begin in Germany at all. Some of them did not begin as German names being carried by German people. They began somewhere else entirely, carried west or north, or across a border that no longer exists on any modern map, and only became German the way a river becomes a coastline. Slowly, and through forces far larger than any single family ever knew. This is not a story about fraud, or mistaken identity, or broken heritage. It is something stranger. It is a story about how surnames survive, but populations move. How a name can stay perfectly still for 400 years while the people carrying it were shaped by migrations, conquests, and quiet unions that no family Bible ever recorded. For most of modern history, the accepted picture of German ancestry was reassuringly simple. Historians and genealogists traced German family lines through the great medieval settlement patterns, the Ostsiedlung, the eastward expansion of German-speaking communities into Slavic territories beginning in the 12th century, and the earlier consolidation of Frankish, Saxon, Alemannic, and Bavarian tribal identities into what would eventually become a unified linguistic and cultural sphere. Surnames themselves became widespread starting in the late medieval period, often derived from occupation, from a father's given name, from a village of origin, or from a physical trait. A name like Müller meant miller, Schmidt meant smith, Bauer meant farmer. Straightforward, functional, German through and through, because the language producing them was German. This was the accepted logic for generations of genealogists. If the name is linguistically German, the lineage is German. Church records, land registries, and town archives seemed to confirm it. Families stayed in the same regions for centuries. The paper trail was clean. The story felt settled. But paper trails only go back so far. And long before a name was ever written down, something else was already moving, blood, not ink. That is where the first cracks began to show, long before anyone had the tools to explain them. Genealogists working the Rhineland and parts of Saxony noticed something odd as early as the 19th century, though they lacked the language to interpret it. Certain family lines carrying thoroughly German surnames kept turning up with cultural traces that did not match, unusual naming conventions borrowed from Slavic or Romance-speaking neighbors, marriage patterns that crossed linguistic borders far more often than expected, village founding legends that hinted at settlers who came from the east, or who came from across the river, folded quietly into local memory and then forgotten. Individually, these were curiosities. Together, they were something else. A signal that did not fit. Then came the genome. Genetic genealogy did not set out to challenge the German origin story. It set out, mostly, to help people find lost relatives and confirm what family trees already suggested. Researchers used 2 very different kinds of evidence to reconstruct deep ancestry. Y chromosome DNA, passed almost unchanged from father to son across generations, could trace a direct paternal line back through time, useful precisely because surnames in most European cultures were also inherited paternally. If a surname and a Y chromosome lineage moved together for centuries, the DNA should, in theory, echo the name's origin. Autosomal DNA told a broader story. Inherited from both parents and reshuffled every generation, it could reveal the wider genetic landscape a person descended from, not just one line, but the accumulated mixture of hundreds of ancestors across 1,000 years. When researchers began comparing large sets of German surnames to their corresponding Y chromosome haplogroups, they expected confirmation. Mostly they got it. But not always. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, the kind where the evidence quietly rewrites the map, consider subscribing, because there is far more hidden in the human past than most family trees ever admit. For a meaningful percentage of surnames long assumed to be ethnically and linguistically German in origin, the Y chromosome lineage told a different story. Haplogroups associated with Slavic-speaking populations to the east appeared attached to unmistakably German names. Haplogroups linked to older Celtic substrates in the Rhineland turned up in families whose surnames were coined centuries after any Celtic language was spoken there. In parts of the Palatinate and border regions near modern France, paternal lines traced back not to Frankish or Germanic origins at all, but to lineages more closely associated with early French and Huguenot populations, families who had, at some point, quietly adopted German surnames without leaving any written trace of the transition. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. The DNA was not undoing German history. It was revealing a layer of it that had never been written down, because it did not need to be. A name changes with a single act: a marriage, a conversion, a resettlement, a decision made by one person in one generation. The genome does not forget that act. It carries it forward, silently, for centuries, long after the memory of Y has disappeared. The story did not collapse. It widened. Several explanations emerged, and researchers were careful, appropriately careful, not to declare one theory the final answer. The evidence pointed toward multiple, overlapping processes rather than a single clean narrative. One explanation centers on the Ostsiedlung itself. As German-speaking settlers moved east into regions inhabited by Slavic communities during the medieval period, the linguistic and cultural exchange was not one-directional. Entire Slavic communities in Silesia, Pomerania, and parts of Saxony adopted German language, German surnames, and eventually German identity over 2 or 3 generations, not through displacement, but through absorption. Their Y chromosome lineages, distinctly Slavic in origin, remained embedded in family lines that had become, in every practical sense, German. A second explanation involves what researchers sometimes describe as quiet religious and political migration. The persecution and displacement of Huguenot Protestants from France in the late 17th century sent tens of thousands of French Protestant families into German territories, particularly Prussia and the Palatinate. Many of these families Germanized their surnames within a generation or two, sometimes translating the name outright, sometimes simply adopting a new one to blend into their host communities. Their paternal DNA lineages, distinctly French in origin, still surface today attached to surnames that sound entirely German. A third explanation is older and harder to pin down precisely: the deep substrate of pre-Germanic populations, Celtic tribes, and even earlier hunter-gatherer and early farming populations, who never fully disappeared from Central Europe. They were absorbed, culturally and linguistically, by successive waves of Germanic-speaking peoples, but their genetic signatures persisted in the Y chromosome lines of families who, 1,000 years later, would take on entirely German names with no memory of what came before. None of these explanations cancel each other out. The evidence suggests all 3 processes happened, in different regions at different times, layered on top of one another like sediment. The landmark study that brought this into sharp focus came from broader European ancient DNA and surname linkage research conducted over the past 2 decades, combining large modern surname databases with Y chromosome sampling and, increasingly, ancient DNA extracted from medieval burial sites. What made this research different from earlier, smaller surname studies was scale: tens of thousands of samples rather than a few hundred, cross-referenced against documented surname origins going back to the 14th and 15th centuries. For the first time, researchers could see not just individual anomalies, but statistically meaningful patterns across entire surname categories. And the pattern held. Consistently, a subset of long-established German surnames, including some tied to a well-known cluster of 14 surnames that genealogists have studied intensively because of their unusually rich documentary record, showed paternal genetic lineages inconsistent with a purely Germanic origin. Not occasionally. Not as statistical noise. As a recurring, explainable pattern rooted in real historical movement. The twist was not that mixing happened. Everyone studying European population history already understood that migration, conquest, and cultural blending were constants, not exceptions. The twist was where the signal pointed, and how invisible the transition had been. These were not conquered populations whose names were forcibly changed and whose origins were recorded in some grim official ledger. These were families who, generation by generation, simply became German, in language, in culture, in self-understanding, while their Y chromosomes carried a memory that no church record, no town census, no family story ever preserved. Not the group historians expected. Not even the region some assumed. The genome was not erasing the German story. It was revealing an older, more layered history beneath it, one where identity had always been something closer to a living process than a fixed inheritance. This matters far beyond genealogy hobbyists tracing their own family trees. It matters because it forces a reconsideration of what ethnic origin has ever really meant in Germany or anywhere else. Populations are not sealed containers. They are not pure, unbroken streams flowing cleanly from some single ancestral source. They are estuaries, places where different currents meet, mix, and eventually become indistinguishable from one another, even though each current, if you trace it far enough back, came from somewhere else. Human history is not linear. It never was. People moved for war, for faith, for land, for love, for survival. They arrived as strangers and left as neighbors. They changed their names the way people have always changed their names, not to deceive anyone, but because a name is a tool for belonging, and belonging is something every generation negotiates fresh. Picture the Rhineland in the late 17th century. A river valley thick with orchards and vineyards, mist settling low over the water in early morning, the kind of landscape that has absorbed 1,000 years of arrivals without ever quite forgetting any of them. A French Protestant family steps off a barge, carrying almost nothing, speaking a language the villagers around them only half understand. Within 2 generations, their grandchildren will speak German as a first language, marry into German families, farm German land under German names. The river does not remember which currents arrived from where. It only remembers that they are all, now, the same water. That is what the genome does too. It does not judge. It does not sort people into categories of purity or authenticity. It simply preserves, quietly, patiently, in a molecule far older than any surname, the record of what actually happened, even when every other record has gone silent. The old story was not wrong, exactly. It was too small. It assumed that a name and a bloodline moved together through history like 2 trains on the same track, never diverging. What the evidence suggests instead is something more human, and honestly more moving, that identity has always been built, chosen, and inherited all at once, in proportions no single generation can fully see. Somewhere in Germany today, a person carries a surname their family has held for 300 years, believing it tells the whole story of who they are. In one sense, it does. It is the name their grandparents were baptized with, the name on the family farm's deed, the name carved into a church pew. In another sense, it is only the visible surface of something far deeper, a molecule quietly holding a memory the family itself forgot it ever had. The map is still incomplete. It probably always will be. Every surname carries not one origin, but a compressed history of choices, unions, migrations, and quiet transformations that no single document could ever capture in full. That is not a loss. It is, if anything, a kind of restoration. A reminder that the people behind any name were never simple, never static, and never quite as isolated from the wider human story as the paperwork liked to suggest. If a story like this changes how you think about your own name, and where it might actually come from, let me know in the comments which surname or population you'd want uncovered next. Because the evidence, it turns out, is rarely finished speaking.